guys, we're back for the next chapter of George's Secret Key to the Universe. We are on chapter 20. I have another horse with me today. Oh, it's the same one I had last time. That's all right. He can come twice. It was pouring when George walked home that afternoon. Cold splats of water hurtled down from the dark gray sky as he trudged along. Cars dived through the big puddles at the edge of the road, sending tidal waves of dirty water swooshing over the pavement. By the time George reached his own street, he was shivering with cold. He'd already had a bad day at school, with losing his rock from space and Ringo picking on him. He got as far as Eric's door and hovered anxiously on the doorstep. He was longing to ring the bell and ask the scientist to help him with his talk for the next day, and he also wanted to find out why Dr. Reaper might think he had disappeared. But he was worried Eric would still be angry with him and send him away. To ring or not to ring? What to do? The skies were getting darker and darker, and suddenly he heard a huge clap of thunder. The rain got even heavier, and George made up his mind. It was important to ask Eric about his talk and tell him about Dr. Reaper. He decided to be brave and ring the bell. Bing bong! He waited for a few seconds, and nothing happened. Just as he was wondering whether to ring again, the door flew open and Eric's head popped out. "George," he said in delight, "it's you! Come in!" He reached out a long arm and whisked George inside, shutting the front door with a brisk slam. To his great surprise, George found himself standing in Eric's hallway, his wet coat dripping onto the bare floorboards. "I'm so sorry," he stammered. "What for?" said Eric, looking a little startled. "What have you done?" "About Annie and the comet and Cosmos," George reminded him. "Oh, that," said Eric. "I'd forgotten all about it, but now that you mention it, don't worry. Annie told me that it was her idea, not yours, and that she made you go into outer space. I take it that's true?" He looked at George over his heavy glasses, his bright eyes twinkling. "So Annie told the truth." Yes, actually it is," said George with relief. "So really," continued Eric, "I should be saying sorry to you for jumping to the wrong conclusion instead of considering all the evidence. I just applied some common sense, otherwise known as prejudice, and came up with a totally wrong answer." George didn't really understand all this, so he just nodded. From the library, he could hear the sound of voices. "Are you having a party?" he asked. "Well, yes, a kind of party," said Eric. "It's a party of scientists. So we like to call it a conference. Why don't you come in and listen? You might be interested. We're talking about Mars. Annie's had to miss it, I'm afraid, as she's still at her granny's. You can tell her about it if you stay." "Oh, yes, please," said George, forgetting in his excitement to ask about his talk or tell Eric about Dr. Reaper. As he took off his wet coat and followed Eric into the library, he could hear a woman's voice. "This is the reason why my colleagues and I strongly advocate a thorough search of our closest neighbor. Who knows, in the end, what we may find by digging underneath the red surface. Mars has red dirt." Eric and George tiptoed into the library. It looked quite different from the last time George had seen it. All the books were neatly arranged on shelves, pictures of the universe hung on the wall in frames, and in the corner lay a pile of carefully folded spacesuits. In the middle of the room, on rows of chairs, sat a group of scientists who were all different shapes and sizes and looked like they had come from all over the world. Eric showed George to a seat, a finger pressed to his lips to show that George should keep very quiet. So, as a good reminder, scientists can look like anybody. They don't necessarily look like Einstein with his messy hair. Standing at the front of the room was the speaker, a tall, beautiful woman with a braid of thick red hair, so long it reached right down past her waist. Her green eyes glittered as she smiled at the scientists gathered for the conference. Just above her head, Cosmos' window portal was showing a red planet. The red-haired speaker continued her talk. Isn't it highly probable that evidence of life, had life existed on Mars in long ago times, is not there for us to find on the surface? We should never forget that every now and then sandstorms radically alter the planet's surface, burying deeper and deeper beneath layers of inorganic dust the entire past of our red neighbor. As she spoke, they all saw through Cosmos' window an enormous sandstorm that took over the whole surface of the red planet. Eric bent his head towards George and whispered, "What she means is that even if there was once life on Mars, we wouldn't see it on the surface today. In fact, I can tell you, this scientist strongly believes there was life on Mars at some stage. She sometimes even declares that there still is life there. That would be one of the most amazing discoveries of all time, but we can't say much more than that at this stage. We need to get out onto this beautiful red planet ourselves to find out." George was about to ask why Mars was red, but realized that the speaker was finishing her talk. "Do you have any questions before we have a short break?" she asked her audience. "After that, we will discuss our last and most important issue." George felt very sad that he had only heard the end of the talk, so he raised his hand to ask something. Meanwhile, all the scientists were murmuring, "Ooh, snacks." None of them wanted to ask a question. "So let's have our well-deserved break then," said Eric, who hadn't spotted George's raised hand. All right. George didn't hear everything, so he had lots of questions. The scientists rushed over to the tea cart in the corner of the room, anxious to nab all the jelly donuts before the others could grab them. But the red-haired speaker had noticed George's thin arm waving in the air. "Well, well," she said, looking at George. "Colleagues, we do have a question after all, and it's from our new fellow down here." The other scientists turned and looked at George. When they saw how small he was, they all smiled and brought their coffee and pastries back to their seats. "What would you like to know?" asked the speaker. Please, if you don't mind," said George, suddenly feeling very shy. He wondered if his question was a really stupid one and whether everyone would laugh at him. He took a deep breath. "Why is Mars red?" he asked. "Good question," said one of the other scientists, blowing on his tea. George breathed a sigh of relief. Professor Kurzgesagt, the red-haired speaker, whose name no one ever managed to pronounce, nodded and started to give George an answer. "If you walk through the hills and mountains here on Earth, you can sometimes see red patches of ground that are not covered with any plants. This is true, for instance, in the Grand Canyon in the United States, but there are many other places where this is also the case. The ground is this red color because there is iron there that has rusted. When iron becomes oxidized, mixed with oxygen, which is another way of saying that it has rusted, it becomes red. It is because of the presence of oxidized iron, rusted iron, that the surface of Mars is red." "Do you mean that Mars is made of iron?" asked George. "Well, not quite. Since we sent some robots to Mars, we know that it is just a thin layer of rusted iron powder that gives Mars its red color. It seems that underneath the layer of red dust, the surface of Mars may be quite similar to the surface of Earth, without the water, that is." So there's the speaker talking and George raising his hand. "So there's no water on Mars?" "There is, but the water we know of is not liquid. On Mars, it's far too hot during the day. Any water turns into vapor and is lost. So the only places where water can remain are those where the temperature always remains cold day and night, so that water can freeze and remain frozen. This happens at the poles, so the top and the bottom. At the North Pole of Mars, we have found large quantities of frozen water, ice. It is the same on Earth, where large ice reservoirs can be found at the poles in the Arctic and the Antarctic." Does that answer your question? "Yes, thank you," said George. He was just busy thinking up another question when Eric stood up at the front of the room, next to the speaker. "Thank you, Professor Kurzgesagt," he said, for your very interesting paper on Mars. Professor Kurtzak bowed and went to take her seat. Dear friends and colleagues, continued Eric, before we move on to the last and most important issue we have to discuss, let me thank you all for making the effort to get here. Some of you have come from far across the globe, but I know the talks we have heard today have made the journey worthwhile. I'm sure I don't need to remind you how important it is that the existence of Cosmos stays a closely guarded secret. The group nodded in agreement. Now, continued Eric, the question we all came to answer is a question of fundamental interest for everyone who is involved in science. We all know far too well how it can be used for evil purposes, and that is why we have all taken the oath of the scientist, so that science is used only for the good of humanity. But we are now facing a dilemma. As you heard in the news and saw at the Environmental March on Saturday, more and more people are concerned about the state of the Earth. So the question we now have to answer is, should we concentrate on finding ways to improve life on Earth and face its problems, or should we try to find another planet for humanity to inhabit or live on? There's Eric talking. All the scientists in the room were silent and looked very serious. George watched them as they wrote an answer on a little piece of paper. Eric then collected the papers in a hat. In total, including Eric and the red-haired speaker, 8 scientists had voted. Eric then started to open up the papers one by one. The Earth. The Earth. Another planet. Another planet. Another planet. The Earth. The Earth. Another planet. Well, well, said Eric. Seems we have a split vote. The red-haired Professor Kurtzak put up her hand. May I make a suggestion? She asked. Everyone else nodded. She got to her feet. George, she said, addressing the boy directly, we may lack a bit of perspective on this matter. Perspective is the way you look at something. Because we are all specialists in our field, so you could maybe tell us what you think about it. All the scientists were looking at him now. George felt very shy and stayed silent for a few seconds. Say what you really think, whispered Professor Kurtzak, twisting his fingers in his lap. George thought about his parents and the Green campaigners. He then thought about the excitement of traveling in space and trying to find another home out there. And then he heard himself say to the scientists, why can't you do both? Interesting question. That is the end of chapter 20. Back on page 189, I think it was, 188 and 189, we have some facts about Mars. So I'm going to read through those. So Mars is the 4th closest planet to the Sun. So Earth is 3rd, Mars would be the next one. Average distance is 141.6 million miles. The diameter across 4,228.4 miles. The surface area is about 0.28 times Earth's surface area, so it's smaller around. The volume, how much space it takes up, is 0.151 of Earth's volume, so it's much smaller space. Its mass is 0.107 of Earth's mass, so it's a lot smaller than Earth. The gravity at the equator is 37.6% of Earth's gravity, so there's less pull at the equator. Mars is a rocky planet with an iron core. In between its core and its red crust, there is a thick, rocky layer. Mars also has a very thin atmosphere, mostly made of carbon dioxide, which we cannot breathe. The average temperature on Mars is very cold, around negative 76 degrees. The largest volcanoes in the solar system, so in all of our planets, the biggest volcanoes are on the surface of Mars. The largest one is called Olympus Mons. From one side to the other, it spreads over a disc-shaped area 403 miles wide and is 15 miles high. So 15 miles would be 60 times around the track, and that would be how high it is. 403 miles, I know that my family lives in Spokane, and that's 400 miles is about how far it is to their house, so it's pretty big. On Earth, the largest volcano is on Hawaii. It is called Mauna Loa and reaches 2.54 miles in height from sea level. So it's a lot different from 15 miles. Though if one measures it from where its base starts at the bottom of the ocean, then it's 10.5 miles high. So page 189. Since Mars has an atmosphere, one can't talk about Martian weather. So because they have an atmosphere, they have weather. It very much resembles what the weather would be like on a very cold desert-covered Earth. Sandstorms are common and huge cyclonic storms, so cyclones kind of like tornadoes, of water ice clouds measuring more than 10 times the size of the United Kingdom have been observed. So that sounds more like a hurricane. Mars is believed to have once been at the right temperature for liquid water to flow on its surface and carve the channels we can now see there. Today, the only confirmed water presence there is the ice caps at the poles, where ice water is mixed with solid carbon dioxide. In December 2006, however, scientists looking at pictures of newly formed gullies on the Martian surface suggested a striking possibility. Liquid water may still be present on Mars, buried deep down under its surface. So that's what they've been looking for recently. All right, Mars has 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos. All right, that's the end of chapter 20.